Hello again, folks. This video is about responsibilities. I bet you're probably tired of listening to me talk endlessly about how debate is about nothing but responsibilities. You're ready to own some people. You're ready to have ultimate victory, defeat people with your arguments. But that's not really what debate is about, is it? Debate is about the exploration of a topic or an issue through a kind of a distance, to where you take on positions based on a lot of highly structured rules that in a passionate argument with somebody you wouldn't have to follow. You'd have to follow maybe some different set of rules. But in debate, the rules are very specific because, like a science lab or any other controlled experiment, debate is meant to provide inquiry and assessment of the options on the table to determine which one is really fully thought through, which one is sometimes better, which one wins. But 9 times out of 10 in a debate, we realize we don't have enough information to determine that. And we're like, wow, that debate was lost by that side, but if we had more information about it, we might have gone the other way. And that's very good because it keeps us humble, and it keeps us really a reality check on what it is we really know and what we don't. That's why debate is so valuable, and it leads to the exploration of so many different ideas. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This video is about building a case and the responsibilities you take on when you engage in debate. So how do we put a case together? You've been assigned a topic, or you've written a topic, you have your group together. The determination of sides is important, and in most cases, in most debate around the world, debate is what we call switch side, which is your side is given to you before you even know what topic you're getting, because again, the role of debate is to practice these very strict, rule-based generations of speech in order to examine an issue. So that's why it's done that way. A lot of people would say switch side is done because of competitive fairness, but the origins of switch side are about training people how to engage in democratic, a particular sense or a particular flavor of democratic organization or democratic investigation of problems and solutions, and that's why it's done that way. Debate requires adherence to particular explicit external sets of rules. Argumentation has rules, but they're often implicit, socially constructed, or conditioned, and often fluid. So that's an interesting difference there, is when you're in an argument, arguments are not planned ahead. Only the most really weird sociopathic person will be like, I'm going to plan how to argue with someone. Maybe if you're trying to get something from somebody, you might plan your argument ahead of time. Most of the time we find ourselves in arguments. We're talking about something, we can't believe someone has said something, and then we're trying to change their mind or show them what they've said is wrong, and we engage in argument that way. Or sometimes we engage in argument when we read something, and we're like, wow, this person is so wrong, and so we make a YouTube video, or we go and write something and post it online about how terrible this person is. So we're involved in argument. But argument usually is exchange, unless we're producing one, written like that. Debate is set up in terms of rules. All the debates that you've ever seen, or that you watch on the internet, or you think about hosting yourself, are based on rules like what time are we going to start, what time are we going to end, how much time is everyone going to have to speak. Arguments are sometimes interminable. There's no governance about how long people are going to speak and things like that, so keep that in mind. It's all about these rule sets and about the artificiality of debate, so it makes debate so powerful. And the adherence to process. That we're going to go through this process and we're going to follow these rules, very, very important. So what are some of the basic rules of any good debate? And this is going to be something you're going to be tested on every time you debate in this class or anytime you debate in life. The first is the burden of proof. The burden of proof means that you provided compelling and sufficient evidence to prove what you're saying is true. Now, in debate, the burden of proof is one side's role, and that's the affirmative. The affirmative, they support the topic. They're trying to prove the topic to be agreeable, that they have defended it, or that they have proven it true, or that they have convinced you that it's right. However you want to put the verbs, that's what the affirmative's job is to convince you that the topic is a good idea. They have to do that through the burden of proof. So what is clear and compelling and good evidence? Well, that's to be determined through the course of the debate and by the audience. There really isn't a universal standard for good evidence, and there shouldn't be. If you are a scientist, your standard of good evidence is going to be very, very different than the standard of evidence you would use to determine if one restaurant's a better value than another one. or that this person should be your representative in Congress over this other person. The evidence you'd use in those three cases, voting for Congress, determining which restaurant is better, and determining whether something is scientifically valid or true, very different, and they should be. Your evidence for saying that someone's a better poet than somebody else, very different than which doctor should I go and see. That's going to be very different. All of this is what we call the rhetorical aspect of debating, which is that the situation and the audience are going to govern a lot of these things, and it's something to keep aware of. But the burden of proof means that the affirmative has to explain why those evidentiary standards are the ones that we'd want to use and why they're meeting and how they're meeting the burden of proof. The negative side is going to say they haven't done that. If they don't meet their burden of proof, there's this other rule, presumption. Presumption is something we assume in democratic society, which is we're going to presume that what we're doing as a democratic order is fine and is going great unless we have evidence to the contrary. So this is an important thing because it keeps things rather conservative. We are going to keep running things the way they are in education. We're going to keep running things the way they are in terms of highway funding and building highways, as long as there's not a problem. And it's the affirmative's job to bring that up and say there's a problem. In a value debate, we're going to presume that the balance would be on whatever it is that we're doing now versus what it is that the burden of proof, the affirmative, wants us to change our mind in some way. So in any debate, someone's trying to change something. They have the greater weight of proving that the change is necessary and good. If they don't do that, we're just going to presume that they're wrong and keep doing and believing whatever we walked into the room believing. Which makes sense, right? There's absolutely no obligation on people who aren't changing their mind to prove that they shouldn't have to change their mind. Now, if the burden of proof is met, and if it's responded to, then we have the burden of rejoinder. The burden of rejoinder is you have to respond to arguments the way that they are established. So if someone presents a very clear and cogent argument with very good proof and evidence to it, you're going to have to do the same thing when you respond. You can't just say, oh yeah. No, you can't do that. I don't know why you would even try to do that. This is where all the fallacies come from. Oh yeah, well that's what you think. Well, you're ugly. This isn't a response. This isn't a rejoinder. I mean, it's a response, isn't it? But it's a pretty terrible one. So rejoinder means like requires like. And it doesn't mean like name calling or anything, but if they make an assertion, you can respond with an assertion and say, we've done our duty responding to this. So that's all it really deals with. I want to spend more of the time in my speech responding to the most important arguments. And that's how you fulfill your duty of rejoinder. So let's look at this in a diagram. The affirmative is the side in support of the topic, of the motion, of the resolution. The negative is the side opposed to the resolution or the motion. So one side thinks it's a good idea, one side does not. And the responsibilities, basic responsibilities are, if I'm trying to change something, I have the burden of proof. The other side, if I'm not trying to change anything, I have presumption. Think about this in a fact-based debate like a murder trial. Sam is guilty of murder in the first degree. Okay, the prosecution has the burden of proof to meet that legal definition. Now, they don't have to argue about definitions here because it's set up in the case law what counts as a conviction in murder 1. It's listed right there in the statute. So what the attorney does is they try to prove that their case meets that statute in front of the jury. All the defense attorney has to do is rely on presumption and say, well, we're going to presume this person is innocent unless there's a reasonable doubt that they are, unless there's no reasonable doubt that they aren't. So they're going to try to establish reasonable doubt, which is what presumption is in the criminal court system. So that's how that works. So once the burden of proof is met, then you have to have a rejoinder, which means you need to have, you need to call into question that evidence. You need to respond with arguments and say, well, no, here's another way to interpret that. You need to call into question their expertise of their evidence and the proof that they're providing. You need to call into question the logic, the thinking, the way that they're thinking and rationalizing it. And that's kind of where the debate really takes off. You don't want a debate decided on presumption. That means the affirmative just didn't do a very good job. And you certainly don't want a debate decided just on meeting the burden of proof or establishing what they call a prima facie case, which is a case that meets the burden of proof, however it's defined for that situation. But a lot of times in debates, especially debates like we're going to be doing, the affirmative has a lot of leeway in setting up what the burden of proof is, but then that can be argued on the meta. Did they meet their job? And then the negative can also argue, but is this the actual way we should be deciding this case? Okay, let's take a look at a policy motion and how that breaks down in specifics in terms of the responsibilities in a debate. We should directly elect the president. This is one of these great electoral college motions, which I'm sure we're going to have a few of these debates. If you want to, it's really up to you. Let's look at the responsibilities. So in a policy debate, the affirmative would have to say what the problem is, how it's harmful, who it's harming and how intensely, what their solution is, and what the advantages of their solution are. So think about it like this. This is like, okay, so if we're going to directly elect the president, let's examine why the current system electing the president fails. Now let's examine who that hurts, or what does that hurt, or how are we harming ourselves through this. Now let's look at how we could directly elect the president. Okay, let's look to the particular advantages of our way of doing it versus any other kind of solution that could be offered. And that's pretty much how you would set up the case. Easy, right? Makes sense. It's kind of natural too. But this is only for policy resolutions, so think of it that way. Now the negative, they have a lot more options than the affirmative. The affirmative is burden of proof, remember? So the negative can kind of poke holes wherever they want. So let's look at what their responsibilities are. The negative can say, well, no, there's not a problem. And no, it's not harm. There might be a problem, but it's not harmful. It's kind of an inert problem. And your solution won't work. And there are many, many more disadvantages to your proposal than there are advantages. So they can do all of these at once, too, which is kind of interesting. The negative can kind of argue in this weird kind of conditional logic, where they can say, oh, no, there's not a problem at all. Well, but if there is, it's not really that harmful. But if it is, and it is harmful, well, they're not going to be able to fix it. But if it is, and it is harmful, and they can fix it, the disadvantages from what they plan to do will cause even worse problems than the ones that they may fix. You know, those problems that may not actually exist, or may exist but are not harmful, that they may not be able to solve, but if they somehow did, it would cause more problems than we have now. Does that make sense? Okay, so in policy motions, the negative has a lot of options. That's the thing I wanted to point out there. So these are a lot of fun, and I think you're probably going to want to do a lot of policy-oriented ones just because of the different kinds of strategy you can come up with. But this would make a very good debate. Even if the negative just focused on one of those and made their whole case out of that, that would be fine. The Electoral College is classist and racist. Wow. Electoral College not doing too well in my examples today. Yeah, they probably deserve it. I don't know. Okay, let's look at the two sides and the responsibilities. Affirmative. How would we know and proving that it meets that standard? Okay, so this is a fact-based motion. So in a fact-based motion, we're trying to prove that something is reasonably true, right? So the first thing the affirmative has to do is define what it means to be classist and racist, and what evidence would warrant the conclusion that something is classist and racist. What evidence would we need there? So then they're going to outline and say, well, here are all the facts, here's all the research we've done, here's everything we found that proves the Electoral College is classist and racist, and you would go to history for that in this case. Or you could go to the expert opinion of people who are legal professors or sociologists or people like that and make those arguments. And that would be quite nice. The negative, again, has a couple of options. They can say, that's not how we know something is classist and racist. We reject your metric. And here's the metric of how we do it. And as you can see under this better metric, it's not classist and racist. So the debate shifts if the negative takes that approach to say, which is the better way of determining if something is classist and racist? Not necessarily if the Electoral College is. You have to determine that first. That's where a lot of the time in the debate would be spent. The next one is we can't know. That's kind of a very kind of nihilistic take. We can't know if something is classist and racist. Maybe not the popular thing, but they could take that position if they wanted to. And say, since we can't really know, we need to evaluate the whether the Electoral College, if it has the maximum amount of risk of being classist and racist, is it still something that, is that still enough to prove that it is? There's another way of knowing. So they could say, well, it might be classist and racist, but they're not doing a good job proving it. So we're going to win the debate by saying that there are better ways to prove that it is this way. And that's kind of a weird way of doing it. And then last one is the most basic one. Well, it doesn't meet your own standards. So the negative might argue the electoral college, they can say, look, it might be a bit classist and racist, but not in the way that they determine it is. We're going to say the electoral college is discriminatory, but in a positive way we need to preserve Republican institutions or Democratic institutions. They can make that argument too. It's about how we would determine what's the burden that we would set in order to determine whether something is classist and racist. How would we know that something is that, and whether or not that's good enough for the negative to accept. Another example, this one's value debate, right? And you knew it was coming, right? Yeah, pretty certain you knew. You guys are smart. It's better to limit democracy with the Electoral College than allow for the risk of populism. Ooh, I like that. Not just because I wrote it. I think it's pretty good. The affirmative in this case would prioritize certain values and then say, why this one than the other one in this case? So why is it better to limit democracy? Because democracy is fragile and democracy requires a lot of protection, and democracy is essential for maximum liberty. So if we're going to have maximum liberty in society, we need to limit maximum liberty in voting, and that keeps populism at bay. And populism is just majority rule. And under majority rule, you don't have maximum liberty. Here's why. And then he would explain it. On the negative side, they could prioritize the values differently and say, democracy is really robust, and democracy really is the people's voice. So why would we ever want to protect us from populism, which is the people's voice? Populism gets a bad rap. We're going to say populism is the majority of people's decision, and they can influence each other. We're not talking about mob rule. We're talking about majority rules, which is a much better way to enact liberty. And they could make that argument. Or they could say, here's why our value is better than theirs. Or they could say, here's why their value prioritization or explanation isn't relevant. They don't really understand democracy. They don't really understand populism. Or they've got the metric wrong. They got the measure wrong. Back on the second one here, why ours is better than theirs is kind of an interesting one to think about, because you could do that in two ways. You could say, actually, we're just defend populism straight up, the way that you've articulated under your rules of how we would in these situations decide which value is paramount. Or you can say, actually, the value is different. They are valuing absolute liberty. We don't think absolute liberty is as valuable as people feeling invested in the system or something, or people being able to vote however they'd like. That's much more valuable. So that debate is going to hinge around two things: which value is superior, and then under that, democracy with limits or populism, which one is better. Okay, so a lot of you in Discord have talked about fallacies and wanting to learn more about the fallacies, so I thought, well, when I put this lecture together, I'll go ahead and give you a lovely fallacy that we can talk about. Here's a mistake. Let's look at this. What if the affirmative says, prove the Electoral College isn't bad? Under the motion, the Electoral College is horrible or racist or evil, or the Electoral College is not real democracy or whatever. The affirmative could say, prove the Electoral College is real democracy. And the negative might then be tempted to go and make a case and say, well, no, actually, the Electoral College is good, and provide all this evidence. And the affirmative would say, no, I don't think so. You provide more. Okay, what's wrong with that? Well, back to the very first slides we looked at in this lecture, the affirmative's duty is the burden of proof. They cannot win a debate if they don't meet the burden of proof. So this trick here, prove the Electoral College isn't bad, is what we call the argument from ignorance, which is a flipping of the burden of proof with presumption, where the affirmative presumes to have their case already proven, and they push the negative onto the defense and make the negative provide all the evidence and meet a burden of proof as such. Now, this is not permitted. And argument from ignorance is so common because people think it's a clever way to debate. People think it's a clever way to argue. But the argumentum ad ignorantum is what it is in Latin. So this is a fallacy. It's a traditionally held fallacy, and it's something you don't want to get caught in doing. Always, always, always in a debate, if somebody is the affirmative or they're supporting the resolution, even if you get together with your friends and set up a debate, whatever that motion is, whatever you've agreed upon is going to be the focus of the debate. Whoever's job it is to advocate for that and to advance that statement is the affirmative. They have the burden of proof. Don't let them go into the like, well, prove to me it's not the case, which may make you sound clever unless you know anything about fallacies. It's a fallacy because it violates the rules of good debate inquiry. That's why it's not permitted. Okay, so this hopefully gives you some basic sense about how to put your case together and what the responsibilities are, whether you're affirmative or negative on a fact, value, or policy proposition. It's a very basic intro. We're going to have more to say about this as the term goes on, but it's really your introduction to how to play. So here's some case building hints I put for you. If you're affirmative, always establish the goal line if you're a fact or value proposition. That means, how do we determine if you've met your burden of proof? Be very explicit about that. You can say, members of the audience, what we need to prove is that this is bad. So how do we know it's bad? 3 things have to be established. It should be very gutsy, be very out there with it, and be very confident about what that is. Of course, it's always good if you can find an expert saying, here's how we know if something is poisonous or dangerous, or here's how we know something is unethical. If you find an expert with that, that's a great way to make that your rubric. And you say, here's what we're going to try to prove. If we meet this, you're going to vote for us. We're going to win the debate. And just be very upfront with it. And I think that's a great way to approach it. If you're in a policy debate, establish a specific problem that can be addressed with a particular plan. Now that sounds kind of dumb, right? What else would you do in a policy debate? But sometimes people just say, yeah, we need to fix it. And they don't go into the specifics. Your advantage as the affirmative is that you can go into as many specifics as you want in terms of the plan. As long as you have the evidence or the proof or the arguments or the testimony that would prove you right, you're in business. So don't be afraid of being very specific about what it is that you're advocating for. They might come back and say, oh, taxation plans don't work. And you can say, well, as you heard, in our case, we're not a taxation plan. Taxes are only a small part of it. We're actually a plan like this. So you can avoid a lot of negative arguments by making sure that you are defending exactly what it is that you'd like to defend. And that's the important thing about having a very clear and well-researched plan in a policy debate. If you're negative, here's some hints. For fact and value, offer your own counter-interpretation of how we would know the right value or the truth. A lot of people miss this. They just argue and they say, oh, well, they didn't prove it, or no, that's not what that means, da, da, da. Instead of that, offer your own interpretation of what you think the paramount value is and what the highest value is. Offer that, and then explain how you would know and why that's the better way of looking at the situation. And then in policy, consider all the disadvantages and how those would be worse than the plan that is best. So you can give the affirmative in a policy debate a lot of credit in terms of what advantages they are going to get. You ask questions about it to kind of diminish their absolute, because if you don't respond to it, if you don't deal with it, a lot of people are going to think that you agree that they're going to solve the problem. So you want to raise questions about that. But then you could say, well, even if they get, let's say they solve 80% of it, they're going to cause these 3 or 4 new problems that you're going to describe in great detail and great rhetorical power why those problems are so bad and we would want to avoid them. Even if we had 80 or 90% of what they claim they would fix, we would still want to avoid all these new problems, so don't do their plan. That's the basics. That's basic case ideas. Ask me any questions you want in Discord or an email, and I'd be happy to go into more detail. But this is just the basic kind of orientation one would take towards debating responsibilities in creating cases and what it is you're going to be expected to do. More specifics to come as we get into the specific topics and the specific things we're going to be debating about this term.